Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon what continent you're on. My name is Margie Mendell. I'm the director of the Karl Polanyi Institute of Political Economy at Concordia University in Montreal. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for the last of our webinars in 2020. And a very important one as we launch a new book on Karl Polanyi. I am delighted to have with us Peadar Kirby, the author of Karl Polanyi and the Contemporary Political Crisis, Transforming Market Economy and the Era of Climate Change. I had the pleasure of reading this manuscript, and I invite you all to order a copy after the webinar. We were informed this morning that Bloomsbury Publishing, which is co-hosting this event today, will be offering a discount up until the end of the year to people who were participating in this webinar. And you can also spread the news if people would like to benefit from a discount. And also local bookstore in Limerick, Sheila Nagig is also offering a discount. We will put the link to the bookstore on the chat. If you could just copy that link and then go ahead and order the book. Just a couple of things before I introduce the event. We have with us 3 speakers, and there will be ample time at the end for questions and comments. And together we decided that rather than just have people write in their questions and comments on the chat, that we would open it up so we could hear you and the speakers could respond to you directly, hear you and see you. But for the rest of the time, please keep your cameras off and mute your mics. So it is time for us to begin. As I said, I had the pleasure and privilege of reading this manuscript, and just to further tempt you to want to read it as well, I would quote Peadar Kirby's own words, and in the book he says that this moment is a Polanyi moment. We are in a moment of a COVID reset or a post-COVID reset. And have a task ahead of us to map an eco-social future, which this book contributes to. It is not formulaic, it is not a guide, it is an inspiration. We will hear from Peadar Kirby, who is Emeritus Professor of International Politics and Public Policy at the University of Limerick. In addition to this book, he is also author of Towards a Second Republic, Irish Politics After the Celtic Tiger, published in 2011, Vulnerability and Violence, The Impact of Globalization, in 2005, Celtic Tiger in Collapse, 2010, and so on. I won't cite all his many publications. We will hear from Professor Attila Melegh, who is the director of the Karl Polanyi Research Center for Global Social Studies at Corvinus University in Budapest. This institute is our sister institute, and the Global Studies, Karl Polanyi Research Center of Global Studies is also the co-sponsor of this event. And I'm also very pleased to have with us Lucy Russell, who is editor with Bloomsbury Publishing and herself a professor of education at Goldsmith College in London. Thank you very much, Lucy, for being with us. We will proceed in the order of Lucy Russell, followed by Peadar Kirby, author of the book, and comments by Professor Attila Melegh, and then if Professor Kirby would like to respond to Professor Melegh before we open up to the audience, to the participants, that's fine. But before I begin, I have the honor and privilege to read to you a message that was sent to Peadar Kirby on the occasion of the launch of Karl Polanyi and the Contemporary Political Crisis. The message was sent by President Michael D. Higgins, the President of Ireland. And I've been given the honor and privilege of reading this quite remarkable message to you. So I will begin. These are the words of the President Michael Higgins. The launch of Professor Kirby's important new book, Karl Polanyi and the Contemporary Political Crisis, Transforming Market Society in the Era of Climate Change, is a most important occasion for those conscious of the destructive consequences that are flowing from a version of the connection between economy, society, and ecology. This book, a highly timely contribution by Professor Kirby, draws on some of the great economic historian Karl Polanyi's most notable contributions, in particular the new public philosophy concept that emphasizes the need to overcome economistic prejudices which so obscure a progressive social vision. The book is premised on the correct understanding, indeed undeniable reality, that our contemporary crises, ecological, political, and socioeconomic, are interlinked and are mutually reinforcing. Then too, taking account of present circumstances, we need to acknowledge that the pandemic crisis in which we now find ourselves is itself interlinked with these other crises, including climate change, an existential crisis, which is our greatest challenge as a global people. The disparate responses to the challenge of COVID-19 have magnified the shortcomings of our paradigm of economy, with all its imbalances, inequities, and injustices, and it has sourced a renewed demand from the citizens of the globe for a new economic order. The destructive trend in lost social cohesion, now extended to every continent, and the adjustment of the basic needs of the people, not only the poorest any longer, to the metrics of a global financialized economy, has been a direct consequence of the pursuit of our failed, disconnected political economy paradigm of some 4 decades. Thus, we have reached a point of multiple crises that demands radical new beginnings. The future of democracy itself is involved, with its assumption of the right to participate in decisions that affect one's life being at stake. Professor Kirby offers such a new beginning in this book, a model that is consistent with Polanyi's core ideas of a market society, as opposed to market economy, and substantivism, that is to say, economics as the broad pursuit of provisioning, as opposed to the narrow pursuit of profit maximization or optimization. Kirby proposes an alternative understanding of the economy, while elaborating on the key challenges we face as global citizens, standing as we are on an existential precipice. As a survey of current discussion of responses and alternatives to our current interacting crises, this book will appeal to a much wider readership than those of us who advocate for a new eco-social paradigm of embedded social economy served by envisaging the economy as instrument rather than hegemonic determinant. Professor Kirby's book is a valuable contribution to an emerging and much needed discourse on the interacting global crises that we face and the emancipatory possibilities of achieving a radical break with a failing and destructive paradigm that privileges the insatiable accumulation of the few at the cost of the many and their children's future, and indeed, in ecological terms, the very future of the planet itself in terms of lost biodiversity and destructive climate change. It would be ingenuous, however, not to mention on an occasion such as this, the difficulty facing those teachers who would like to have writers such as Polanyi or Kirby be taught in Economics 101. Polanyi provided hope for an emancipatory power of humanistic social science, articulated in great contributions such as The Great Transformation, work that has stood the test of time and is as relevant today as it was in the 1940s when it first emerged. I am certain that contemporary contributions to the discourse on global challenges and necessary systemic change, such as that we are launching today, as well as a new wave of enlightened scholarship, such as that emerging from Mariana Mazzucato, Ian Goff, Anna Coote, Kate Raworth, and many others, will be of invaluable assistance as we develop, encourage, and disseminate a radical alternative to our failed paradigm. It will, however, constitute quite a battle to have even pluralism, not to speak of emancipatory texts. The Paris of 1968 seems a long-lost dream in terms of energetic intellectual activism, making it all the more necessary to support students agitating for a curriculum that is appropriate for a new departure. The recovery of Karl Polanyi as a resource for our times is apposite. It constitutes the recovery of a moral sensibility in which a symmetry can be found between social economy, meaningful inclusion in a full participatory sense, and above all, most urgently, within an ecological responsibility. I commend Peadar Kirby for rekindling and repurposing these great ideas in a contemporary context, offering a new departure that represents our best hope for a sustainable, inclusive future on the planet, while being an important gesture towards intergenerational solidarity. Michael D. Higgins, President of Ireland. I'm sure that all of you online with us today share the amazement and wonderment of how Ireland could have such a remarkable person as Michael Higgins as their president. Thank you so much, President Michael Higgins, for these words of inspiration. And as an economist, I certainly second your plea for revision of economics curricula in all economics departments and social science departments and universities around the world. Now it's only, I have one last thing to say before I pass the mic, so to speak, to Lucy Russell, and that is that Professor Karl Polanyi Levitt is with us today. She is, because of COVID, she's currently in a senior's residence, and it's difficult for her to access internet. And so with the help of her wonderful assistant, Jason Toney, she's able to listen to this webinar by telephone. So Karl Polanyi Levitt is with us today. Lucy Russell, may I now pass the mic to you.
Thank you, Margie. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you, and I'd like to thank the Karl Polanyi Institute of Political Economy for organising this event and for inviting me and Bloomsbury colleagues to be here. We're delighted to be able to celebrate Professor Peadar Kirby's new book, Karl Polanyi and the Contemporary Political Crisis, Transforming Market Society in the Era of Climate Change. And to start us off, I thought I'd just speak briefly on three of the key elements that have consistently struck us when working on Peadar's book. And by us, I mean us as an editorial team, our colleagues in the marketing team, and most certainly the academic reviewers and journalists that we've been in touch with. The first is the subject of the book itself, which is not only inescapably timely, but so multifaceted. Kirby engages with and brings to bear such a diverse but interconnected set of bodies of knowledge and recent literatures, from, of course, centrally Karl Polanyi and the Polanyi scholarship to current work in political economy, critiques of capitalism, degrowth, populism, green politics and grassroots, debates about finance, financialization, history of ideas, and sociology. And it's this wealth of knowledge and current examples that really gives the book a richness as you read it. The second point is how beautifully written Peadar's book is. To write engagingly and clearly whilst communicating complex and urgent ideas is far from easy. It really is a skill, and it's one that Peadar masterfully brings to his discussions. passion too. Early on in the process, one of the reviewers commented on how Kirby's passionate commitment to inspiring social movements that seek to reform the structure of the world order shines through in his writing, and it absolutely does. Thirdly, the authors. We're honoured, of course, that President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, wrote the foreword to the book, and feel very lucky too to be working with Peadar. With Peadar's background in international politics and public policy, and his continuing work in globalisation, sustainability, and low carbon transition, to name but some of the topics he's working on, it's difficult to think of someone more ideally suited to write this book. And that's something that's really apparent as you turn the pages. Conscious, however, that this has the potential to sound rather biased, I thought I'd read out one of the many quotes we've received commending Kirby's work, as it really sums up, I think, these 3 points that make this book such an exciting contribution to Polanyi scholarship and indeed to debates on the global crisis. This one comes from Jack Schenker, journalist, author, and former Egypt correspondent for The Guardian. I quote, "Our increasingly unstable world is not lacking contemporary examinations of the forces remaking it. The climate emergency, a crisis of economic and political legitimacy, technological transformation, and urgent debates over how we conceptualize our relationship to place, borders, social identities, and each other. But few writers have been bold or skillful enough to pull these complex threads together and successfully anchor their analysis in the intellectual history of thinkers who can help us make sense of how we got here and where we might be going next." In his vital and brilliant study of Karl Polanyi's relevance in the 21st century, Peadar Kirby has not only achieved this, but also sketches out the beginnings of the world we need to fight for. End of quote. So having shown, I hope, how and why we think Peadar's book is so important, I've also been asked to let you all know of some practicalities. Firstly, if anyone joining us today would like to review Karl Polanyi and the contemporary political crisis in a journal or an online publication you're associated with, we'd love to hear from you. The email address for this is academicreviews@bloomsbury.com. That's all one word, academicreviews@bloomsbury.com. Secondly, I'm delighted to share with you all a discount code for attendees today. Please use the code Polanyi35, or one word, for 35% off the hardback edition on bloomsbury.com. And that's valid until the 31st of December. So perfect for some Christmas shopping, perhaps. Thirdly, there'll also be a paperback edition available in due course. Publishing first in hardback, we're aiming to have the paperback edition available by the end of 2021. So that's coming. For now, though, we're delighted that the hardback edition publishes tomorrow on the 10th of December 2020. And I invite you all to read this urgent intervention into how, with Polanyi's scholarship, we can look beyond criticisms of global capitalism to ways in which we can transform the global order. Thank you very much, and I'll now pass to Peadar.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Lucy, for those wonderful words, and many thanks to Margie for leading off today, and of course for hosting this launch, which means so much to me. Instead of talking about my book, I thought that it would be good maybe to spend the time talking about the genesis of the book, what led me to this book, and filling in to some extent what to me are the crucial insights and why they're the things that I've noticed. Living in an eco-village here in Cloughjordan in North Tipperary in Ireland, it's opened my eyes to aspects that perhaps I didn't appreciate so much before I came to live here. So I go back to almost 30 years ago when beginning my PhD studies at the London School of Economics, my then supervisor, Professor Fred Halliday, much missed by many of us, said to me, the first thing he wanted me to read was a book by a guy called Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation. I'd never heard of Karl Polanyi. I still have a vivid memory of the visceral experience it was 28 years ago in the autumn of 1992, as I began my doctoral studies, when I read The Great Transformation. And little did I know that Karl Polanyi was going to guide my academic career in the decades following, right down to the present day. There isn't a publication I've published, I think, in which I don't mention him. Certainly, he was crucial to the critique that I began to develop around the Celtic Tiger, and which I think was recognized as quite unique at the time, at the high point of that boom in Ireland. And my 2005 book that's been mentioned by Margie on vulnerability and globalization is really a working out in book-length form of a core insight of Karl Polanyi, which is the relationship between poverty and belonging, which has always struck me as being a fundamentally rich dimension of Polanyi, but which doesn't often get recognized. I remember mentioning it to Carrie when we spoke at the Academy of Sciences in Budapest back in the mid-2000s, and I was thrilled when she said that I had captured her father's understanding of poverty. It often strikes me that if only that understanding of poverty, which is, I suppose, to some extent, loosely mirrored in attempts by the European Union to develop a more adequate understanding of poverty, but if that had really informed public policy, particularly in the more developed parts of the world, I think we wouldn't be now in the middle of a crisis of Trumpism and Brexit and all the other extreme right-wing crises that have emerged in our time. So that's only one very small example. But with every passing year, as the global order began unraveling in ways that were predictable to anybody acquainted with Polanyi's core insights on the destruction that happens if we hand over the running of society to the automaton of the self-governing market, then we began to see that destruction playing out before our eyes, very ably charted by the wonderful analysis and writings of Carrie. And I'm thrilled to think that Carrie is with us here today. And of course, Carrie drew our attention and applied in such an insightful way the analysis of Polanyi over the last 3 decades as the world began to change so fundamentally. And I think what has stuck with me is that the shocking, in some ways almost exaggerated descriptions in the Great Transformation and elsewhere of the destruction that would happen to society and to nature if we handed them over to the running of the market, that we have seen, certainly over my adult life, I've seen that destructive impact being played out in perhaps ways that Karl Polanyi himself couldn't have imagined that his words were describing so accurately. And I go back to them now, and I go back to them in the book, and really it's shocking. So those have been the years of my life. I moved then to live in Cloughjordan Eco Village in 2009. And so the issue of climate change and biodiversity loss took on even greater centrality in my concerns. I began to realize as a working social scientist, immersed in the social sciences for much of my adult life, that they are constituted in such a way that they find it almost impossible to really take into account that all our social life, and by that I include economics and our cultural life, depend on a flourishing and regenerative ecosystem. In attempting to bring those concerns into my lecturing and my writing, I came to conclude really that it would require turning social science on its head, something that's not really happening. So here again, Polanyi has proven to be an almost lone prophetic voice at the heart of social science theorizing. And then in the 2010s came the emergence of the new right, the new populism, as it's often called. I suppose as a student of Latin America, I had become immersed in the study of populism. In fact, I had come to conclude quite early on that Irish politics is quintessentially populist. But as the new populism emerged, I saw the word populism being used as a sort of a dismissive term by many commentators, including academics. But returning to the rise of Polanyi's readings of the rise of fascism in the 1920s and the 1930s, of course, we can realize that this is no surprising turn that's happening in our politics, because his analysis has been usually helpful, certainly to me and to many others, I think, in understanding what is the cause of these very fundamental and, to me, very scary shifts that are taking place. So over recent years, and I think this is the more immediate genesis of the book, I've found myself increasingly pulled between two parallel universes. On the one hand, I was immersed in an avalanche of books and articles trying to make sense of Trump, of Brexit, of the new right in Europe and beyond. And that's still a huge endeavor trying to make sense of it. But on the other hand, there's an equally voluminous literature that's dissecting with ever growing alarm the damage to our climate and to our ecosystems, largely caused by pressures deriving from the ways in which we organize our economy, our mobility, our consumption, our agriculture, indeed, the very personal and social values that most of us live by. So this book really is my attempt to try to draw these two universes together, as the subtitle indicates. And in that attempt, it's two key elements of the current order, or I suppose disorder, as we should more accurately call it, that became very major concerns for me. Because at the very time when capitalism is showing itself locked into a trajectory that's fast destroying both the social and the environmental conditions that have underpinned it, the critical socialist tradition that for a century and a half fostered an anti-capitalist politics and anti-capitalist analysis was effectively absent, relegated to being a weak voice on the margins, even if that. And amid the oceans of diagnosis of our ills and the prescriptions for curing them, what seems missing is any robust and well-grounded alternative, as our president has reminded us. Because the arguments are either people defending liberalism, or on the other side, undermining it with a politics of indignation. From where are going to emerge the pathways beyond, the seeds of the new future? Is there any more urgent question facing humanity today? So really, it's that drew me to write this book. And as I said to Margie, it's a book that largely wrote itself throughout the year of 2019. I delivered it to the publishers just about this time last year, as Lucy will attest to. And then, of course, in the second quarter of 2020, COVID hit us. And I remember saying to Lucy and to Lisa Thompson, the commissioning editor, really, I need to revise the whole manuscript to take into account what COVID is teaching us. And I suppose as I did so, I realized that COVID-19 has been a wake-up call to all of us, alerting us in a graphic form to the dangerous dead end that humanity has entered into over recent times. Now, it's up to others to judge the book's worth, and I'm certainly looking forward to what Attila Melegh has to say after me. But what has surprised and excited me is the richness of diagnosis and prescription that I was able to mine out of Polanyi's oeuvre when I examined it in the light of a starting point that the system is breaking down in multiple ways. So where do we go? What do we do? That was my starting point. And I suppose living in our eco-village community has helped me it's helped to reinforce some central insights of Polanyi that I think have been rather neglected. Certainly for me, they were neglected. Central to these, I think, is Polanyi's recognition that bonds of reciprocity have down the ages been central to the flourishing of societies and their economic systems. I think in our capitalist, highly commodified system, it's been hard to really appreciate the depth and the richness of that insight. But living here in this wonderful community has taught me that powerfully. As we say so beautifully in Gaelic, Ska a Céile a Bharamut. And of course, that means not just that we live in one another's shadow, but we live under one another's protection. And this has become a daily experience for us here in this community. None more so, of course, than during this pandemic. So I think I therefore devoted more attention to Polanyi's three forms of social integration, familiar to any student of Polanyi, and to his powerful writings on community, which really took on a resonance for me that they never had before. I'd largely missed that. His reminder that our current economic system hampers real community, as, to quote him, he wrote, it acts, that meaning the current economic system, acts like an invisible boundary isolating all individuals into their day-to-day activities, has proven very, very apt. So getting to know and appreciate the eco-village and the wonderful community that we live with has opened my eyes to the significance of the myriad of grassroots projects like our own, which are sowing the seeds of a post-capitalist future in ways that are really quintessentially Polanyian. It was the growing conviction that the future society is already being incubated in the shell of the old that was the starting point, really, for this book. It led me to dedicate the book to the community of Cloughjordan Eco-Village, as I write. And I added that from them, I have learned a lot of what is in this book, and without them, I could not have written it. I mean that sincerely. And so the learning here is multidimensional. The learning I'm meaning in Cloughjordan Eco-Village, not easy at all times, and it certainly has stretched me. And the fruits of it are in this book. Somewhat to my surprise, I think, as I wrote the book, it was the pendulum of commodification and decommodification that became the central core of the book, as I was forced to move beyond the rather limited focus, which I think a lot of Polanyi scholars and writings focus in on, of the double movement, again, familiar to anybody who's read Polanyi, and yet to take me back into the heart of what I now think was his central concern and should be ours. While decommodifying labor led to the emergence of the welfare state, of course now profoundly eroded almost everywhere, the time is long overdue to give the same attention to decommodifying land, or as Polanyi made very clear, by land he meant the whole of nature, and decommodifying money, as he understood and as he emphasized. So the core of my book is devoted, in a way I didn't expect or intend, to chapters on the decommodification of land, labor, and money. And I do think that's the core of a political agenda for our times. I'd often also quoted Polanyi's fears about the age of the machine, as he called it, his fears about technology, I think without ever fully understanding them. But again, they came profoundly real for me this time around. And this was helped by a contribution from a rather unlikely quarter, namely Pope Francis's analysis of the dominant power of the techno-economic paradigm is in his encyclical letter, Laudato Si, published in 2015. The Pope expresses a central Polanyian insight here. Perhaps, I must admit, even better than Polanyi did himself. I'm daring to say that, and I wonder what Carrie might make of it. So this brings me to the rather strange recognition to some extent, but I did come to this towards the end of writing this book, that the thinking of Pope Francis, expressed both in Laudato Si on care for our common home, and just 6 weeks ago in his latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, on social solidarity and community, that his thinking is quintessentially Polanyian, though I can't find any references to Polanyi in any of his writings that I'm familiar with. It was a friend of mine who drew my attention to the fact that some leading theologians have indeed examined these similarities between the thinking of the Pope and Polanyi, including the late Canadian theologian Gregory Baum. I find this remarkable, and it makes me convinced that something deep is at last stirring in the undergrowth of alternatives that holds the seeds of the radically new future that we so desperately need. And to this, of course, Polanyi is indispensable. So enough said. It remains to me to thank many people. And in searching around for a publisher for this book, after a number of refusals or no replies, I feel very lucky to have been taken on by Bloomsbury, and I've never felt better treated as an author. So many thanks to Lucy, to the commissioning editor Lisa Thompson, whom I dealt with from the beginning, to Brina Armstrong in marketing, whom I've gone to know more recently, and indeed to all the team at Bloomsbury. I feel you appreciate my work, and that's been emphasized again by the wonderful words of Lucy just now. Of course, a very special thanks to Margie and to Anna and to all at the Karl Polanyi Institute for hosting this launch, which means a lot to me. And of course, to Carrie herself. And I am thrilled that Carrie is listening in today. Her writings over the years have helped so much to broaden and deepen our knowledge of her father's work. And I'm only sorry that I can't engage more actively with her, and she can't engage with my book. But I do feel very, very honored to have had the benefit of having met her on a number of occasions. I very much want to acknowledge the support of President Higgins for his work over many years, or his support for my work, I should add, both as a senator in the early 1980s when he launched my book in Gaelic, A Díolán as Nicaragua, a diary from Nicaragua, where I was looking at the attacks on Nicaragua by the Contras, as the Minister for Culture in the government in the 1990s when he launched another book of mine in English, and of course now in a very special way for his generous foreword for this book and for the lengthy message that Margie has read out. This far surpasses even his support in earlier years, and my gratitude to him is indeed immense. And then finally, and by no means least or last, is my own immediate community, my family, my daughters Breed and Quiva, and especially my partner Tony. You have all provided those multiple forms of support and sustenance that one can easily take for granted. I tried to write this book in a way that would make it accessible to Tony, as she asked me to, and I hope I've succeeded. My heartfelt thanks to you all. So I now hand over to Attila Melegh, who, as director of the Polanyi Institute in Budapest, is going to review my book, and I'm greatly looking forward to it. Attila, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and it's an extreme honor to be with all of you in celebrating this new book. It's a great privilege to be with Professor Kirby, great privilege to be with Lucy and Margie, very importantly, who has been organizing this, and also my heartiest, warmest wishes to Karl Polanyi as well, who has been an engine of many things and bringing people within this universe together to think in critically. So in this spirit, actually, I just to show that I prepared for celebration, I took even a glass of wine for that purpose. So let me go through my reading of this book, which has been extremely important during this fall period, and I'm sure that this is going to remain like this in the future as well. So, a smooth and excellent book has been written by Professor Peadar Kirby. It reads like Tokaj wine, in case you know what I'm meaning. It seems to be just some dessert wine, but it gets into your brain and nerve systems quickly, and our hard head starts circulating. Having read this very important book, the reader cannot escape from asking the questions of Kirby again and again. Are we going to run into a catastrophe, or we can change the key elements of the system? As the book also cites Rosa Luxemburg and her question, socialism or barbarism, now this reads in this new format, ecologically, an ecological and the human disaster or systemic change. The book has 4 parts, and logically it goes always from clarifying the problems with extremely important and lucid reconstructions of the most up-to-date literature. We learn about the ongoing crisis of the so-called market societies as understood in a Polanyian way. In details, we go through systemic failures of capitalism in its forms within globalization, privatization, new populism, disembedded identities, lack of democracy, issues of technology, climate change, social destruction, processes of commodification, and the problems of fictitious commodities, land, labor, and very importantly, money. This makes the book like an excellent critical textbook on globalization in its current form. I'm saying this not for the publisher, although they should listen. Anyway, I will, and I'm sure many of the listeners here will give this book to students of global social change. After all diagnoses in this book, we always move toward possible solutions, or better to say, strategic directions which are understood as possible as a possibility of eco-socialisms, and better to say, as a structurally critical, non-nationalist double movement to counterbalance and eradicate some of the most problematic features of the current market utopia, and to creating a new public philosophy in order to move beyond market society. As I said, as a tricky wine, Kirby pours into us the ideas of various alternatives, including commons-based peer production, forms of capital control, a new Green Deal, a decentralized democratic economy, new type of globalization, not destroying but reconstructing the state, providing for more regionalism and localism. Very importantly, it talks about degrowth, a new substantivist economy, which is re-embedded into democratic and participatory control. The book thus gives an excellent summary of the current deep-seated crisis, and very importantly, what answers, reactions have been produced to this ongoing ecological, social, and financial ordeal. Too many systemic problems and tensions have appeared. As Polany said crystal clearly in 1945, the free market is leading to crazy nationalisms. He said at that time concerning Eastern Europe, but it is true for all around the world. This he wrote in his excellent piece on universal capitalism or regional planning. Of course, Kirby clearly sees that crazy nationalism is misleading. It is truly false consciousness, as understood by Georg Lukács, the great philosopher in his book on history and class consciousness, who was actually sharing the Viennese exile with Polanyi in the previous authoritarian cycle of capitalism in the 1920s century. Using the understanding of Lukács, this form of consciousness leads not to the easing of structural conflicts, but makes it even a bit deeper. So it is truly false, not because it has no real roots in history, but because with this we bump into the wall. But I would like to stress something, and I think it's important, and we have to be calm, that nationalism has to contain some super strong historical forces we need to dwell on, we need to tame. One is the widespread rejection of free global market approach and the longing for protection, the critique of new block logic of globalization and capitalism. And these blocks, as we can see all around, are also crumbling, regardless of being very strong drives of current capitalism. What a prediction we got from another thinker 100 years ago, Bukharin, who said that this continental block logic would dominate capitalism in the coming era. And then in which capital is trying to achieve success and, very importantly, false social coherence to hide its social distress. The nationalist critique, especially within the European Union, raises that the nation state is to be seen as a social shield hiding how it has been captured. So it means that the nation state is seen as a social shield, hiding the fact that it has been captured by nationalist and non-nationalist elites to play with. There are anti-elite emotions and angers in this nationalism, but very importantly, they are led and hystericized by the elite groups with the fake media campaigns they are launching every day. This is very dangerous poison. This rising nationalist hegemony relies on additional other forces which we do not dwell on here. The key point for us, critical people, would like to pass a livable globe, and in this I praise the book very highly, is that false political movements can continue their amok, because in the current historical situation, there is no real existing future model. And this book tries to help, for which we have to be thankful. So this book is exceptional because it is actually venturing to look into the future to find a new model. Excellent mixture. But being already captured by Kirby and his book, let me go into some extra analytical tasks to be built on this argument. This is not criticism in a classical sense, but calls for the continuation of this work so precious from the point of view of humanity. The book demonstrates we have to move beyond market society. True point. But are these proposals and developments are enough to break the satanic mirrors, as Polanyi put it? Or we need to move beyond capital? Be careful now, I'm not misusing the term. I'm using actually the philosophy of István Mészáros, who said we not only need to move beyond capitalism, but beyond capital. Mészáros is a recently died Lukács disciple as well. But now, let me summarize some concerns, lamentations on historical possibilities emerging from my reading of the book. The book basically argues for anti-systemic revolutions. This word is a combination of revolution and reforms, which I learned from Timothy Garton-Ash in the 1980s. It quotes and rethinks various critical reports, analyses concerning our financial, social, and ecological crises. And they are superbly summed up in this book. But do we see the masses, political forces behind them? Do we see them being enough to make these plans viable? Or we are just trying to persuade again the elites which live on this scenario? Do we hope that masses will like these models in parliamentary elections in the current discursive scenario, and parliamentary politics will ever allow this, or we need to have wider democratic turn before we can face the historical challenges in front of us? I'm afraid we need to continue the work of Kirby and see what exact historical opportunities we have, and whether the current political forms will ever allow us to finish the project of revolutions. Second, the book beautifully tells us that humanity is longing for ecologically and socially safer and protected habitats. But it comes as a feeling together with some alternative attempts being only in a symbiotic relationship with the current states and pro-market actors. Can these alternatives emerge as a force articulating steps toward the new model? Are we able to protect these startups, these followers of early socialists like Owen in their work? Have we thought over the overall and super concrete structural conditions to allow them in doing the great transformation? Or we remain in the hands of the current actors and remain paralyzed and mesmerized by the hegemonic media control put on us? The book for me is an honest, intellectually absolutely revealing testimony of such dilemmas. Third, the book clearly says, and says it rightly, that ownership change and related democratic control is needed. It stresses this very well, but it does not put into the center how wider social groups can regain control beyond symbiotic attempts with some support from friendly states, possibly. The book is correct. This new model has to be born within the society before we move beyond market society, as critical philosophy of history warned us 200 years ago. But this looks very fragile today in my eyes. Is it just enough to say we have a pendulum between commodification and decommodification, marketizations and double movements? I'm absolutely aware that in some ways Polanyi had this balancing vision of historical change, and this idea needs to be thought over for capitalisms and the socialism of the 20th and the 21st century, of course. I just raised this as this is how I read many of the insights of the famous anthropologist Chris Hahn concerning socialism and post-socialism in Eastern Europe. Do we need to say more concrete things? Is this pendulum a true engine of historical change? Do we need to remain in this cyclical pendulum, or we can break out of it? Is this our historical destiny? If yes, then why and how it is built into our social historical body? What is the theory which tells us that institutionally and structurally we have to remain in this balancing tensions? For instance, the book is full of excellent ideas of democratic control of techno giants. But is it enough if some employee control is built into the current techno giant world, as also suggested by employees of Google and so on, talking in the newly made documentary called The Social Dilemma, promoted by another big company called Netflix? Is this change enough? Break the satanic muse, as Polanyi put it, concerning the destructive logic of autonomous super financialized markets, and as eloquently explained by the book. Huge companies being financed and financing the financial markets, I'm not mistaken, I'm saying this, and gains forming horrible circles in the system. Concretely, I mean the complex chaos of digital capitalism, its shares, loans, monopolies, and very importantly, the shadow hell of derivatives, hedge funds related to this business sector. Who and what is going to introduce this control over the financial background, and with what political support? I am not criticizing the book. I just call for additional work, what Kirby has started. 4. The book is absolutely correct that the first cycle of socialism had horrendous problems. But I'm not throwing out the baby with the water by putting the first cycle of socialism into the sole interpretative framework of being a dictatorial failure, misunderstanding and misguiding socialist thinking and practice. Were not there such elements which can help us and at the moment they are hidden in the negative evaluation? I definitely think, yes, there are useful elements, and we have a historical duty in this respect. For instance, us, East European intellectuals, we have a clear task to show the true picture of experimenting with non-capitalist mixed economic models in operation and provide them a better understanding how, and this is very important, and I hope people can listen to me, how the mixed system, meaning the different forms of integration, the different forms of economies in a non-capitalist environment can cooperate with each other, because we need a multi-sectoral, a mixed model. And how alternative forms, state, communities, cooperatives, households, can be linked. I think socialism was finished when it should have been pushed toward democratic versions. And it was finished in a terrible way, with terrible Hayekian programs of privatization and market utopia. So we should have continued the thinking over the experimenting with the mixing of market with alternative community, household, and state-based forms while controlling capital, financial, and very importantly, land market. This work, I think, has just been started a little bit, regardless of warnings coming from anthropologists like Chris Hahn. Maybe in a Polanyian way, the first phase of socialism between the 1920s and 60s was just another form of disembedding as too much redistribution was put into the system, and then it started moving toward the more balanced forms of integration within post-capitalist circumstances. Maybe the post-capitalism of Eastern Europe, and I can go ahead, Cuba, China, needs to be revisited before we can go on. Maybe socially and politically embedded non-capitalist systems truly have balancing cycles of markets, states and households, as opposed to the capitalist metabolism eating up all the other alternative forms. I think that was one of the deepest dilemmas of Karl Polanyi himself. All in all, I can only agree with Kirby, as he puts it in his book, and let me quote, "There is a need, therefore, to critically assess the legacy of socialism and draw from it those elements that can contribute toward transitioning to a more secure, egalitarian, and sustainable future in mapping the eco-social future." The only thing I can say, I am a very faithful colleague in doing this work. The book is great on describing fictitious commodification and its consequences. But scientifically, do we have the full picture without asking what non-market processes also lead to commodification in the current framework? What social factors lead toward commodification? For instance, I just give one example. Aging, the collapse of families, and them just being, by mean of family being just a group of wage earners, and together this with hierarchical developmental levels, this pushes toward marketization in social care, not just because capitalist elites are pushing this, creating a booming transnational care industry. Are we not praying just a picture that elites and companies force on us neoliberal straitjackets without acknowledging how society in the current framework also pushes into that direction? The elite projects and the drive of capital are very real things, and maybe, but maybe not enough as explanations. Maybe we need to have thinkers like the author in showing with critical sociology what social complicity we have in these marketization waves. 7, and this is going to be the last one and then I finish. The book also argues that strong international regulations should help in controlling and even doing decommodification. Excellent point. And we need to think this over very carefully. But once again, some horrible failures we also see. The legally well-developed international asylum-seeking system has just collapsed. Our colleagues in studying international migration regimes, like colleague Sonia Lucarelli in Bologna, knows very well that the EU migratory regimes just have not functioned at all based on international and EU legislation. Who has the power to implement this if nation states do not follow global justice, but make a program actually for violating them? Let me ask, all communities would agree with these programs in the current historical world? I am afraid, for instance, East European local communities are in a terrible anxiety at the moment, and this is not just the creation of Prime Minister Orbán. I am afraid I just raised some questions bothering me by reading the book, but let me clarify this clearly concerning this excellent book. I told above, it is a critical, and do not misunderstand me, a critical drug which will grasp you, and it doesn't matter what background you have, you start reading this book, and after reading it, you will be involved in an everyday difficult exercise. Have we progressed toward a better eco-social future? And what more a book can aim for in our very difficult period? I can only say thank you to Professor Kirby for this absolutely amazing and excellent push. Thank you very much, and let me congratulate again.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Peadar. Thank you, Attila. Before we open up to questions, I'd like to ask Peadar if he would like to just make any comments, respond to Attila Melegh's comments.
Thank you, Margie. I will just make a few very brief comments. First of all, is my thanks to Attila for having read the book carefully and for having engaged with it critically. Of course, you know, it's the greatest benefit to an author to have somebody who will engage critically. And the 7 points he raised, I'd need to see them in writing and ponder them, but each of them seemed to me to raise really interesting, really research projects in the best sense of the word, which I would love to be involved in, and hopefully opportunities will arise. Yes, of course, we are in this really complex and scary and sort of end of era times where everything in terms of the seeds of the alternative seem to be so weak. And Attila is absolutely correct in the points that he makes. I really agree with him about the fact that we have failed to acknowledge that the real existing socialism of Eastern European societies and societies beyond that have so many lessons to offer us that, of course, the way that they were obliterated has not allowed us to learn. And again, Attila, living in one of those post-communist societies, is obviously much more attuned to what those lessons are. So all I can say is many thanks. I look forward to developing a relationship with Attila and perhaps other scholars around the world. If my book inspires work on some of those really crucial cutting edge where we can bring scholarship and social theory at its very best, of course, particularly from the Polanyian school and the Polanyian network, to bear on the actual empirical observation of what is happening in so many rich ways, because there is so much that's happening that holds the seed of this alternative, then I will feel that my work is worth something. So thank you, Attila, very much.
Thank you, Peadar. We have 25 minutes to engage with participants. There are many people who are with us, and I would ask you to go to your chat box, and there's an option, or you go to where it says more with 3 dots, and you can raise your hand. And if we see hand, or when we see raised hands, I will call upon you to comment or ask a question. So the floor is open to the many people who have joined us today. Please feel free to intervene. All right, and I see so far there are no hands as yet. Perhaps what I can do is ask a question just to, hold on, thank you. There is a question from Aileen. Sorry, I missed the comment. Can you send that to me again, please, Jean-Francois? It just disappeared. Aileen O'Carroll. Aileen O'Carroll, if you just turn off your mute, you will be able to ask your question. Maybe you can tell us where you're from, please. Are you there, Aileen O'Carroll? Jean-Francois, is her mic now open? Okay. And then there's another question from Paul Gillespie. Aileen O'Carroll. Oh, that was a mistake. Okay, how about Paul Gillespie? Is Paul Gillespie with us and wishing to ask a question or make a comment? If so, please unmute yourself and tell us where you're from. I'm wondering if there's a problem. Do I hear Paul Gillespie? Yes, there we are. Go ahead. And you can put your video on if you like so we can see you. You don't have to.
Hold on now. Hello, I'm a friend and colleague of Peadar, and very much welcome this book and the linkages that he's drawn. And taken a bit by surprise. I didn't expect to be asking a question so rapidly, but it's a very stimulating intervention that he's made, and drawing on the remarks of President Higgins, how does he see the linkages between, he could speak a bit further about the linkages between the growth of sentiment in existing society and the forces of change. He's referred to the eco-village experience, but how does he see that playing out in the COVID experience, and how does he see it playing out, and I'm talking from a European perspective here, in the arguments over the way European policy ought to go? Thank you.
Okay. Peadar, would you like to answer? Go ahead. Peadar?
I'm sorry, Paul, I got distracted when you were speaking. I didn't, somebody came into the room to me. I didn't hear your question.
But I was let me repeat that in summary. What I was saying, I'm very interested in your perspectives on how the new society can grow from within the existing society. And I'm wondering what thoughts you have about the forces, the progressive forces for making for a new society within the COVID crisis of recent months, and more generally, and from a European perspective, within the arguments about the way European policy ought to go in dealing with issues of technology, of economic integration, and indeed of COVID, and COVID not only in Europe but on the world stage. Do you see elements in that sense of progressive elements within European politics along these lines?
Thank you, Paul. It is a vast question, and it's interesting to ponder. Well, I suppose the first thing I'd say is that one of the things that had struck me in my work in recent years, and partly because, of course, I live in a community that is seeking to embody a post-capitalist future, that I begin to recognize that there is a huge amount happening all over the world, in every society in the world, that is seeking to sow the seeds, some places more successfully than others, but of really flourishing local economies and local systems, local cultural systems, which are moving towards decommodification. And I have a short footnote in the book which uses our own Cloughjordan Community Farm here as an example of how that embodies a very different form of decommodified financial system. So that's one thing. I think those models are there. They tend to be rather invisible. I think they often tend to see themselves as being very much on the margins of the system. I think Eric Olin writes a division between interstitial and reformist, and I'm just trying to think what the third one was, offers a way of conceptually looking at these. In other words, are these interstitial, are these seeds that I'm talking about interstitial spaces that can be opened up? And of course, the more they're opened up, the more they're transforming the base, not just the social base, but also the economic base of the dominant system. But you're right, of course, this can't go very far. I mean, it can create small local little seed beds, if you like, but it can't really become a transformative project for the whole of society until you have political levels from the local right up to the global, through the regional, like the European Union, that also get involved, that appreciate that there is here the seeds of a new system. So just to take a few examples, I was struck by the fact that the letter signed by, I think it was about 185 European academics that was sent to the European Commission, was it 2 years ago, when there was a meeting organized in the European institutions on degrowth, that here are the seeds of a different set of priorities that are beginning to emerge within the academic community, and we begin to see the early signs of them beginning to be taken on in some quarters in the political community. The mindset out of which the degrowth movement has come, it seems to me, is itself worthy of a lot of study, because it is really an imaginative leap out of the ways, the sort of analytical ways in which we've organized the economy before, into something, it seems to me, to be far closer to Polanyi's substantivist understanding of economy. And that has been very, very much relegated, not just within academic life, but within our common understandings of economy. Obviously, you know, going back to what Attila was saying, to some of the energy and the intellectual frameworks of socialism, including social democracy, and the need to very radically regulate capital, to break up capital. We're beginning to see some signs of this emerging within Europe, even in some more radical quarters within US politics. That's very interesting. So my sense is, if it's any help, that we are on a trajectory where very radically different conceptualizations of how society operates are beginning to bud forth. Where they're going to go, of course, as I repeat, until we see these strengthening themselves within political systems, then I think they're going to be very limited in terms of their impact. But I mean, all I have to do is think back to 2-3 years ago, when the concept of degrowth was so marginalized, including in academic quarters, and now to think that it is a subject where there's quite a lot of literature, very, very interesting literature emerging, shows how new concepts, not just concepts within the existing conceptual frameworks, but concepts that are profoundly subversive of that framework are gaining traction, including intellectual traction. Now, that's maybe an inadequate answer to the extent to which it doesn't offer sort of clear conceptual categories for seeing, you know, for sort of strategizing where we're going. But it does seem to me to offer really robust seeds of an alternative that need to be much more carefully followed. And for us intellectuals, we need to be far more closely in contact with these, and progressively and critically, of course, accompanying them. I hope that was of some use, Paul. This is an issue to be discussed when we can get together again.
Okay. Thank you, Peadar. I have Tony Ryan.
Margie, Tony is my wife, and that was a mistake. She didn't mean to put up her hand. So that's what had distracted me when Paul had asked.
Tony Ryan, no, that's a mistake?
That's a mistake, yeah.
Okay, well then there's a question that came to you in writing from Patty Abozaglo, and she says, I would like to ask Peadar about his thoughts on the issue of leadership. Are there signs of the new leaderships and values underpinning new leadership style so badly needed to maintain healthy, peaceful, and sustainable communities? Where would these leaderships be? Who are these leaders? How do we foster this? And she adds a congratulations to you for the book. So if you could answer Patty Abozaglo, please.
Excellent question, Patty. Good to see you linked in. Yes, of course, leadership is crucial. And if we look at the public level, nationally and even internationally, there are very, very few figures that one could point to. In fact, the very opposite is what we see. We see an embarrassing amount of people in key leadership positions who clearly don't have any real authority or any real capacity to offer leadership with vision, with understanding, with a strategic capacity. However, I do think that in certain areas we're seeing really remarkable leadership emerging. I would point to Extinction Rebellion, to the schools' climate strikes, to Greta Thunberg herself, of course. Now, this, I think, is of the utmost significance. I write in the book that I think Greta Thunberg's address to the United Nations General Assembly, was it last year or the year before, where she berated them for their addiction to the illusion of growth, indicated something really profound about what seems to be emerging, which is that we have this fundamental consciousness change happening among a whole generation, and what's going to happen to that and where that's going to go. These people understand even better than I do, I think, than probably any people of our generation, the existential future that threatens them, profoundly threatens them. And they're standing up, and they're standing up courageously, they're standing up creatively, they're standing up with really, I think, really advanced forms of how do you engage in protest actions, for example, that attend also to people's well-being, that attend to people to engaging with the public in ways that don't alienate them, but educate them. So it's protest as education. It's picking up on some of the best elements of the left-wing tradition, but it's taking them in new directions, very creative directions. All that is leadership for our times. It's prophetic leadership. It's determined leadership. It's strategizing leadership, and that does fill me with hope. I meet here in the Eco Village such wonderful people, such wonderful young people who really are questing in really fundamental and radical ways for something new that gets very little attention by public media, but it's there as an element of our society, and that's where my hope is for the future, I must say. I hope that's of some use, Patty.
Okay, I have another live question from Tim Crowley, but before, Tim, you ask your question, one of the participants, Frank Dorr, says the chat is disabled. It's not. You have to go to the Q&A and not to the chat. Okay, so please just go to the Q&A. Tim Crowley, I invite you to ask your question or make your comment.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I don't seem to be able to switch on my video here, but congratulations, Peadar, on the publication of the book. And I'll introduce myself as a friend of Peadar and of Cloughjordan Eco Village, calling in from Dublin. So my question to Peadar is reference the recent COVID crisis, which I know you've addressed in the book, but comparing that to the climate crisis, which has been described as a tragedy of the commons. What is all our problem is nobody's problem, and that makes it so intrinsically difficult to address. And how that compares to the recent global pandemic, where that wasn't the case, and society internationally seemed to recognize the problem for the most part and tackle it with a great deal of solidarity. And to compare that with the climate crisis, where that solidarity and shared vision seems to be so much more difficult to achieve. And are there learnings which we can take from that? Does it come back to the leadership you've already addressed? But I'm certainly very interested in the parallels and what we can learn from the pandemic crisis that we are still going through.
Thanks, Tim, and good to see you on board for the launch. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I wonder myself, when I was revising the book in the second quarter of this year, taking into account the COVID crisis, it's a number of things struck me. The first thing struck me was that this really is a very Polanyian moment. It's a moment where suddenly society is opened up, the unexpected happens, and we're forced to realize that the dominant market system simply has little or nothing to offer when suddenly something hits us back from within nature. I mean, this is the origins of this are in nature and in the way in which we have so intensified our production and our colonizing of wild spaces that we have weakened the obstacles or the protections against diseases coming into the human race from animals. So how is it going to help us? Well, I hope at one level it's a wake-up call to that suddenly states had to step in, states had to do the unthinkable, and states did do the unthinkable, and they did the unthinkable in the name of human well-being, not in the name of profit, which unfortunately, certainly since the advent of neoliberalism in the 1980s, has been the dominant value system, the dominant priority for most states around the world. Secondly, I think it's hit our value systems, our personal value systems, the things that we took for granted, and suddenly finding that overnight we can't do the most intimate things. We can't hug people, we can't hold hands, we can't now meet people in people's houses, etc. All of these shake us to the core. There's positive and negative. We've had to find ways in which we can enjoy ourselves, ways in which we can find some of them, I suppose, commodified through the media, but some decommodified ways. Walking in nature, appreciating the importance of nature, opening our eyes to nature. Now, I think those seeds are sown and they won't go away. Of course, I expect that once we get vaccinated, we'll all rush back into our bad old habits. But I think something deeper has happened. And of course, to the crisis of climate change, and of biodiversity, hoping that it will open people's eyes to take this more seriously. And I think there is evidence around that it's doing that. So again, I see it within a trajectory, and while to the observer it may seem a slow trajectory of social change, it's not like the old model we have of a revolution suddenly happening because a new social force takes over the running of society. But I think it's a more deeply embedded form of social change, and it is happening probably much faster than we realize. So, I mean, by and large, even though of course, there's huge causes for the most ultimate concerns about where we're going as a human race on this planet, that one sees fast emerging a pushback, a counterpower, a critique in which capital controls us and sucks value out of local communities in all sorts of ways, that I hope is, again, future historians will see as a crucial moment in our stepping beyond into the seeds of a new world. I think we're back at the time when capitalism was born out of feudalism, that historians who look at that, I mean, century transition can find seeds there for what's beginning to happen in our own times, I think in a rather speeded up tempo.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give you the last two questions. First one, Nimra Nisar, many congratulations. I want to ask you what inspired you to write this book. I think you addressed it, but perhaps you address it again. And then a question from Barry Cannon. Congratulations, Peadar, on the publication of this important new book. I wonder if in the book you engaged with the issue of identity, that is gender, race, ethnicity, not to mention class, and how you see this intersecting with the need for fundamental systemic change, which you seem to be calling for. So we'll take those last two questions.
Thank you very much. What inspired me to write the book? I suppose it was an inspiration. I think the core of the inspiration to write the book came from that recognition that I mentioned when I was talking to Paul Gillespie, which is that the alternative is under our eyes. It's the seeds of that alternative are being sown everywhere. And when I say seeds, I don't mean they're invisible beneath the ground. There are small projects everywhere, in every region, in every country in the world, which often very creatively, often with people's backs really against the wall, are doing really stunning and marvelous and visionary things. And when we encounter them, we may appreciate that, but we automatically presume that they're so weak and they're so marginal and they're so small that they're really of little longer term and major consequence. I disagree with that because I think they're all over the place. And that made me think, well, can I sort of look again at the whole trajectory of society, look at it in the context of the huge system breakdown that we're in the midst of, and go back to Polanyi, because of course it's where I always go back to for a robust theoretical framework to make sense of what's going on. And it took me on a journey that I suppose I didn't expect to be taken on, It was a challenging journey because I thought, particularly those chapters on decommodification, I really was scared going into those. I didn't know what I was going to say. And again, as I said at the beginning, and as I said to Margie a week or two ago, the book sort of wrote itself. So I don't know what that says about me, but it was working out the initial inspiration that there's more going on here than we see. And then these fundamental questions: where are we going? What is the alternative? Because I do think that's the thing that most troubles me in all the debates that are taking place, the lack of a visionary alternative. And that's why I mentioned Pope Francis, because really it's Laudato Si, that sort of almost, you know, it's like the Mao's Red Book moment for our times. It's a book of such stunning originality and vision and breadth and inspiration that really carries the seeds of this alternative also. So that was some of my inspiration. What is the alternative? And I hope I've opened up in some little way the pathways towards that. That's all one can do, I think. Barry raises a very big question. Barry, good to see you on board from Barcelona. Identity is, of course, crucial. I cover it in passing, not because I believe it's not important, but because in the big scheme of things within this book, it had its place. To me, in many ways, identity is the reason why we see our politics going in such a dysfunctional direction. And I suppose it is because in many ways our politics has been taken over by a neoliberal addiction to handing over power to the market and to the technocratic power that goes with that. That's why I mentioned the techno-economic paradigm that the Pope, I think, is best of anybody in describing and appreciating its power over our lives and over our societies. It is the fact that our identities as real people in all the manifold diversity, and you mentioned many aspects of that diversity. And of course, ultimately, the diversity is the diverse reality that all of us, individuals, are different and have somewhat different needs. And ultimately, we all need to belong. And that's at the core of identity. And that has been so profoundly lacking in the dominant technocratic and economistic and market-based politics and the way in which we've run society, that of course the backlash was bound to come, and so I try to. I mean, I think I mine out of Polanyi, because I do think Polanyi was very central to him, and I mentioned that is his understanding of poverty as lack of belonging rather than as lack of material goods. Not that that isn't necessary, of course it is necessary, but where you forget that sense of belonging, as our dominant politics and our dominant paradigm has done, then you're sowing the seeds of real destruction. Polanyi realized that, and we're now realizing it in our times, and we need to get back to a politics that takes human diversity, human reality seriously, a humane politics again. And I see our university sector being taken over by this neoliberal business-oriented technocratic paradigm. And it scares me, because where are we going to get the seed beds of the new ideas if our university systems, and I see it everywhere, there's very few alternatives, have been taken over now, this has really, and again, it's a Polanyian insight, this restructuring has taken place over recent decades. And it almost is impervious to a critique or to a debate. So real education is now taking place in sectors outside, certainly the formal university sector. And I see it in our own eco-village here. It's the most wonderful place to educate people, because the scales drop from their eyes when they see what can be done by a small community and the alternative that can be sown. Unfortunately, they're not getting that in universities now. So I hope that's a rather meandering response, Barry. But yes, identity is crucial, and identity can't be handed over to the new right, because that just takes us down a completely destructive path. Identity has to be built into a generous politics, to a generous substantivist economics that really meets people's real needs rather than the needs of capital and the needs of technological corporations.
Thank you. With your permission, Peadar, I will just I will read you. There were just two more comments that came in. One is a comment, and the other is got a question built into it. And if you don't mind responding to it, I'll read you the comment first, and that was from Sándor Stricker, who's a member of the Polany family, in addition to being a well-known, recognized scholar in his own field in cultural studies. Just a remark, excellent, Professor Kirby, thank you for your remarks on the effects of COVID-19. These are times when we could see at last that life is more precious than profit. Looking forward to reading your book, Sándor Stricker, from Nagymaros in Hungary. And then a comment and question. My name is Artur Colom, and I am one of Peadar's colleagues in Valencia, Spain. We share a subject in a master's program in economic policy at the University of Valencia. The contribution of Peadar to the program is really appreciated by the students, since very few of them have ever heard of Polany. Bad times for heterodox economics in Spain. My question, you mentioned that the current COVID crisis forced you to modify some points of the book. Which points did you feel that needed to be changed? Congratulations for the book, Peadar. Thank you all. So if you could kindly respond to that, we will close with that last question and comment.
Thank you, Artur, y gracias por estar con nosotros hoy. Espero que algunos de los estudiantes están también. I didn't, if I said that the COVID crisis led me to revise some aspects of the book, I didn't mean it in the sense that I was revising my ideas or going back in my ideas. I was revising the text of the book to take into account this new experience we were living through. In many ways, my experience of revising the whole text of the book in the light of the COVID crisis confirmed my core insights. And in some ways, it seemed to me to make the book more credible. Because this time last year, when I delivered the book to Bloomsbury, I suppose one of my senses was this book just seems so way beyond where most people are at that it will be hard for many people to really take it very seriously. And yet suddenly, within a few weeks even, certainly within a few months, suddenly we had states that were intervening. We had our whole lives turned upside down. We had drawn to our attention in the most graphic ways the damage being done, the potential damage to our global family of our meddling with biodiversity. And then we had this unique experience that this wasn't just a crisis for some countries, the so-called underdeveloped countries or whatever. There's these divisions that we divided the world into for so long. It's a crisis for all of us. Though, of course, it hits people in poorer societies, living in poorer regions in very particular and more difficult ways. But it hits all of us. And it should be a reminder we're all together in this. We're one human family. We're not divided into different nation states as if that's some ultimate identity that gives us a privilege over everybody else. So those were some of the revisions. They strengthened the argument, they strengthened the values, they strengthened the hope that out of this will come, that we're on the cusp of a new era in human history.
Thank you very much. We've gone a little over time, but I thank you for your generosity. We have almost 100 people who have stayed with us since the beginning. I want to thank Peadar Kirby, Attila, Melegh, Lucy Russell, Bloomsbury Publishing for taking the initiative to publish this really excellent book that I invite everyone who's with us to order and take advantage of the discounts that are being offered to you now by the local bookstore and by Bloomsbury, and you have the websites. If you require any further information or you didn't catch the links, you can write to the Polany Institute and we will provide that for you. Peadar, there were so many quotes, there were so many terms that you raised and phrases that I think are all potential titles for your next book. But one that you mentioned right at the end, and you called for generous substantivist economics and politics. I propose that be the title of your next book, and that be the sort of guiding pathway for all of us who are trying to work collectively to co-design a better future in the spirit of Karl Polanyi and the many issues that you have raised so eloquently today and that are so articulately and expressed in the book. Attila, thank you so much for your comments, the work you agreed to take this, to accept the invitation to comment on the book in the midst of a very hectic schedule. I'm aware of how hectic it is. Lucy, thank you also for telling us how Bloomsbury was inspired and I think quite lucky to have the opportunity to publish this very excellent book, which I hope will also be translated into other languages, particularly Spanish, given your own work, Peadar, in Spain and former work in Central America, but perhaps into Hungarian and Korean. I'm thinking of or German. I'm thinking of our sister institutes around the world. For the Karl Polanyi Institute and for me personally and my colleagues, it's really been a pleasure and a privilege today, particularly, but also in the last several weeks. As soon as I was invited to write an endorsement for the book, I immediately wrote to Peadar and to the publisher, and I said, please, can we launch this? This would really be an honor for us to launch it. So it is an honor, and here we are in December of 2020, certainly the most difficult and challenging year we've ever faced in our lifetime. We'll get through it, but it remains a challenge. And as I've said in all our webinars, the paradox of these hard times is that we are able to reach out and reach so many people that would not otherwise have been possible. Yes, of course, we'd be together physically, and there are all the advantages of being together that we all miss terribly, but that we are able to engage in these very large international conversations that we've been doing now over the last few months, and our colleagues in Budapest have been doing this, our colleagues in Vienna as well. Our biggest challenge now is that the day isn't long enough to be able to participate in these interesting events. So my heartfelt, warmest thanks to all of you. I know I'm expressing gratitude as well from Carrie, and I will tell you, Peadar, that the next request will come from Carrie, and that is that I and others read the book aloud to her. So that's our project. We do read to Carrie regularly, and as she's sight impaired, and it will be really a pleasure to share this wonderful book with her. And if she has any comments for you, you can be sure you'll receive these through Jason and Tony by email. I almost forgot, very important. We have an international conference in April, April 22nd to 24th, the Karl Polanyi 15th International Conference. The title is The Role of the State in the Post-COVID 21st Century. We extended the deadline to send abstracts, proposals to the 11th of December, but because there are many people here who perhaps we do not know and maybe did not see that notice, I'm making an executive decision, and you can, if it interests you, please send us an abstract within the next week. All that information is also available from the Polanyi Institute. I can only now say thank you again. Thank you, really heartfelt thanks. I thought this was an absolutely superb superb session, really inspirational. It has been recorded, as have the others, and we will send out a newsletter at the end of the year with the links so people can access these. I see somebody's asking for a comment. Oh, sorry. And despite everything, I wish you all a happy holiday season. I think we had a big dress rehearsal in the spring, and somehow people are adapting better to the confinement and the lack of socialization and contact that we usually have at this time of the year. There is hope. There's light at the end of the tunnel. There is a vaccine. Fingers crossed that it's effective and that it will be distributed equitably, which I think is really a big challenge. Months ago, in something I wrote, I said this ought to be a global public good, and it should not be the decision of individual countries who are bargaining and ordering their supplies and competing. This has to be a global public good. There are many countries in the global south that are at the end of the line, and this is really a concern that we need to address. Thank you from everyone. There have been messages coming in, and to be continued. We'll see you in 2021. Have a happy new year. Happy is a strange word, but a good new year, a hopeful new year, and we need to mobilize and work towards a generous world that will see that solidarity that has been expressed really quite visibly and inspirationally throughout this period, that solidarity will continue as we hopefully will resume some form of a normal life, but not business as usual. We are not going back. We are going forward. Many, many thanks.
Thank you, Margie. Thank you very much.
Have a good evening.
Goodbye, everybody.
Good day. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Congratulations.